Welcome, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Perry, the director of the Harvard-Yenching Institute, and it's my pleasure today to serve as moderator of the annual Harvard-Yenching Roundtable, which, as you know, is this year focused on the topic of modernizing Asia's countryside. We have today 5 extremely knowledgeable panelists from 5 different countries in Asia: China, Japan, Korea, India, Vietnam. They all have very long, very impressive records of publications and also prizes, both academic prizes and prizes for policy interventions in their respective countries. Before I turn to the panelists, I'd like to say just a few words by way of background to explain this event. The Harvard-Yenching Roundtable was introduced more than 10 years ago in connection with the annual Association for Asian Studies meeting, at which Harvard-Yenching each year sponsors a distinguished scholar from Asia as a keynote speaker. The Harvard-Yenching Institute then invites the keynoter to come to Harvard, where they're joined by a panel of other leading scholars from different parts of Asia to discuss a topic that's related to the core interests of the keynoter. This year follows that same basic format, except that, with the exception of me, all the participants today, of course, are speaking not from Cambridge, Massachusetts, but from their own homes across Asia. So let me first just very briefly tell you who the panelists are today. Then I'll make just a few very brief remarks by way of introduction, and then we'll get started. This year's keynote speaker, around whose research the roundtable has been formed, is Professor Wendy Jin of Renmin University in China. I'm sure Professor Nguyen is known to many of you as a very influential agricultural economist and an advocate of rural development. He initiated the new rural reconstruction movement, an effort to revitalize the Chinese countryside in a way that benefits smallholders and is also environmentally friendly and sustainable. He will first make some opening comments, and then he will be followed by the other panelists. First, Professor Han Bilhyun, a sociologist at the Academy of Korea Studies, who has written extensively on Korea's rural development experience, also in comparative perspective. We'll turn then to Professor Wendy Phuong Cham of the Institute of Cultural Studies at the Vietnam Academy of Social Sciences in Hanoi. She has conducted path-breaking anthropological studies of cultural change in rural Vietnam, and especially the borderlands between Vietnam and China. Next, we will turn to Professor Nishikawa Kunio, an economist at the College of Agriculture at Ibaraki University in Japan, who has done extensive field work in the Japanese countryside, focused especially on the sustainability of rice cultivation in that country. And then we will wrap up initial comments with Professor Mini Sukumar, who teaches women's studies at the University of Calicut in Kerala, and whose academic work and social activism has focused on the empowerment of women in rural India. After they have made some opening remarks, we'll see whether the panelists have any questions or comments for each other. And then, if time permits, the floor will be open to questions from the audience, which I will ask you to submit in writing through the question and answer function on Zoom. We will try to wrap up by 11 o'clock here in Cambridge. It's 11 in the morning here in Cambridge, but it's nighttime. in Asia, and our panelists are being very kind to spend their evening with us. I know many of you in the audience are also in different parts of Asia, and so we will wrap up after a couple of hours so that those of you who are in Asia can get to bed. First, a couple of words about modernizing Asia's countryside. As all of you know, the 20th century witnessed many different kinds of efforts to modernize different parts of the Asian countryside. These included both top-down sponsored programs and bottom-up societal initiatives to transform and in some cases to revolutionize rural economies and rural societies. Initially, of course, a key focus of modernization of the countryside was to improve agricultural productivity so that the countryside could be a secure foundation for industrial development. But even before these countries had fully industrialized, other programs of rural modernization were introduced to try to redress the imbalance in living standards and in public goods provision between the city and the countryside, and also to try to revitalize the hollowed out villages where workers had left for the cities. Today, in the 21st century, we see a renewed interest in Asia's countryside, partly because of disenchantment with urbanization, partly because of disenchantment with globalization, partly because of mounting anxiety over climate change and environmental degradation, partly because of food safety and public health crises. These have refocused the attention of governments and also academics on the critical role of the countryside. This past year, the pandemic conditions that we've all been facing have contributed to a striking reversal of internal migration in many of the countries that we study, with unemployed workers leaving the cities and going back to the countryside, often to their native villages. In India, I understand 2020 saw the second largest mass migration in India's history, second only to partition, as tens of millions of unemployed workers in India left the cities and went back to safety nets in the countryside. In China as well, we've seen tens of millions of people in a reverse migration chain from the city to the countryside. In China, President Xi Jinping has made rural revitalization a national priority. And in other countries as well in Asia, we've seen renewed interest. Japan also has seen a much more modest, but still a kind of return often of young professionals who prefer to telecommute from the countryside than from crowded conditions in the city, or who may just prefer to be closer to nature. And Prime Minister Suga in Japan, who himself is the son of a farmer from northern Japan, has made revitalization of the Japanese countryside a major goal of his administration. In India, we've seen the removal of some traditional government safeguards for agriculture, sparking dramatic farmers' protests that have captured international attention. In Vietnam, for the past 10 years, we've seen the new rural development program unfolding in various ways. In South Korea, we've seen in the 21st century a so-called ecological turn. And these all offer, I think, important examples of efforts to promote rural development. In the Vietnamese case, through government guidance. In the Korean case, as a critique of government developmentalism. So this seems like a good time for us to consider how different Asian countries are addressing issues of rural modernization in distinctive and yet also interconnected ways. And to reflect on these questions, I've asked each of our 5 panelists to start off today with some brief comments on what they consider to be particularly successful and unsuccessful examples of rural modernization in their own countries. Why have some of these many programs generated some major improvements in rural conditions? Why have others fallen short, sometimes tragically short? What have these countries learned from their achievements and their shortcomings? Are these lessons transferable from one country to another? And what might lie ahead for Asian villages in the remaining years of the 21st century? So to get us started today, I'm going to turn first to Professor Wendy Jin. Professor Nguyen, as I mentioned, is well known for having started the new rural reconstruction movement across China. I might mention that back in 1968, at the age of 17, Wendy Jin, like tens of millions of Chinese young people at the time, was sent up to the mountains and down to the countryside, in his case, to work in rural Shanxi province for the next 11 years. And Professor Nguyen, I think, still credits those 11 years of his youth spent in rural Shanxi province with having awakened him to the plight of the Chinese peasantry. After he graduated from university in his early 30s, he devoted his career to research and policy experimentation directed toward rural development. And for the past 20 years, he's been establishing rural reconstruction centers in different parts of China to train now some 200,000 young Chinese people to go to the countryside to establish cooperatives, to promote organic farming and sustainable agriculture, to set up community colleges for peasants, to heighten environmental consciousness and the like. He has also published widely on questions of rural development and has, I might mention, a forthcoming book in English from Palgrave that will be out this spring, entitled 10 Crises, the Political Economy of China's Development, 1949 to 2020. So let me begin by asking Professor Wendy Jin to get us started today. Professor Nguyen.
Thank you, Professor Perry. And thank you for inviting me here to give my experiences and my study outcomes and to contribute for this roundtable. I think that's very important that this roundtable, the title is not the modernizing agriculture. It's a modernizing Asian countryside. It's a quite different concept. And when we talk about agriculture modernization, I said this became a kind of national strategy in the year of 1956. That is when China make Soviet Union as a model. It's a kind of modernization and try to set up the big farm system and the collective system and whatever. And in 1980s, China tried to learn from US, but it's also the big farm system and then very deep capitalization. So I think that the modernization of our agriculture means that the high capital investments and then enlarge the farm size. That is very difficult in Asia. Up to now, Japan, Korea, and some even the modernized economy, they cannot enlarge the household farm size. So that is still be a small household farm that is not exactly a kind of capitalized modernization agriculture. So when we talk about the concept of countryside modernization, I think that it's very important to know that And the modernization in countryside means the equity of the physical investments. Originally, I mean, before the new century, and rural China contribute a lot to the urban China. It's that means that when the country want to set up the industrialization, they need to take big surplus from the countryside, both from the peasants, also from the agriculture. So the agriculture and the peasant society, they contribute a lot to the urban industrialization, especially that when urban industry need to have a kind of primitive accumulation for the capital. So that is the reason of the countryside always poor. Peasants always be poor because they contribute a lot for this the whole cities, the capital primitive accumulation. So that is unequal, means that the local people in countryside contribute a lot, but they have less from the government's budget. But the situation changed not by some kind of when the governments have enough budget, they can do something as a kind of investments to set up the public service. That is another thing. It's regularly people would like to believe that when you do have the money, you do have the investments from the government budget, and then you can do something as equity. But in China, that is quite strange. 1997, when we were facing the East Asian financial turmoils, that is happened in 1997, and somehow in central policy discussion, and people raise up the suggestion that we need to take some measures, like when America met the 1930s crisis, Roosevelt set up a kind of Roosevelt New Deal. So by such kind of learning, we raise up a kind of very special policy. That's the new countryside construction. It's a late 20th century. In the year 1998 or 1999, China started to talk about when we're facing the crisis, means that you need to deal with the crisis by what kind of measures? Some people raise up, we can set up the countryside construction, in name of new countryside construction to deal with the crisis. Because 1997 East Asian financial turmoils happened, overseas demand largely decreased, and then we need to have a kind of domestic investments to draw economic growth. So that's from 1998 to 1999, China started to think about what is the new room for absorb this surplus industrial capacity from the urban to the rural. And then the year 2005, the central government's very formally to raise up a kind of a new state strategy in name of new countryside construction. From that time, the governments issued a lot of government debts to use the government debts invest into countryside to make this big industrial surplus, capital surplus, turn this big surplus into the rural construction, especially for the infrastructure construction and the social construction. That is very, very different policy. And when you're facing the crisis, you need to concern the crisis happening in the urban area. So you need to concern about the urban problem, how to deal with, how to solve the problem. But at that time, the policy circle talk about, okay, we turn this direction. We go to the countryside. We do the investments into the countryside, and then to enlarge the room for the domestic demand. This something like 1980s, when the 1970s China faced the very serious physical deficits. China turned their policy focus on the countryside construction. So the rural reform make the domestic demand enlarge more fast, and then to absorb these cities, industrial surplus into the countryside. So in the new century, we have the similar policy. We learned from 1930s Roosevelt New Deal, and then we turn to the Chinese version, and then to have a kind of new countryside construction. So my argument is that when we talk about the countryside construction, we need to first focus on the physical investments, make the countryside and the urban area equity, means that the balance of the physical investments to make the rural people can enjoy the same treatment of the budget investments, means that when you can make the rural people have the same education, same medical service, and the social construction, whatever, means the social service and the infrastructure constructions, whatever, all are equal between rural and urban. That is modernization. It doesn't mean that you need to get this big capital to go into the countryside to capitalize the common people's natural materials, and then to take the benefits outside of the countryside. That is not the modernization. The modernization means the equity between rural and urban. So that is these years we gave somehow these positive comments to the central policy, because that one by another, from 2005, China emphasized the new countryside construction, started to give large amount of the physical investments from the central to every countryside village. That is the first large amount of investments to make the equity. And then that's almost 10 trillion American dollars. Symbol is a big money. And then 2/3 is the budget debts. So it means that governments issued bonds, and then to enlarge the ability from the physical, especially the central physical ability, to do the equity investments in the countryside. That is never discussed by outside China. The scholars and the politicians, they don't focus on such kind of change. And then when the new authority taking place in the year 2012, they are trying to change to focus on the urban development. So it's a large amount of investments into the urban infrastructure construction. That's urbanization, accelerate urbanization. But just several years later, they found this is a big trouble, because it's the pollution became larger and larger, and then the import, you need to import a lot of materials and oil and gas, whatever. So it's not sustainability. It's a negative for the country's safety. And then you also need to, because you want to import a lot, so you need to export a lot. That is a deep falling into the globalization. And so then they found this is a big trouble, so they turned the strategy from the globalization into the internal circle, and then focus on the rural revitalization. Rural revitalization means that we at least have a 3 million natural village. Originally from the first decade of 21st century, we have almost set up the pavement road, pipe water, and electricity, and Wi-Fi, and everything built up into the administrative village. But we have a 500,000 administrative village, but we have another 3 million natural village. So it's became a much bigger room for absorb its surplus industrial capacity and the financial capacity. Means that the surplus of financial capital and the surplus of industrial capital all can have a new room in countryside construction. So how to solve, how to deal with the crisis, how to reduce the government failures, that is extremely important for the countryside construction, because that we cannot just rely on these small households to set up any modernization for themselves. So if you cannot have these big government's physical investments, means that the equity cannot become the real in the countryside. So from the 2017, China changed direction, the policy direction, reinvest into the countryside. That is the rural revitalization. Focus on these 3 million natural village to build up the pavement road, pipe water, and electricity, and Wi-Fi, and whatever, build up into the natural village to make all the local people in the countryside can enjoy the public service, can have the equal rights for education and public service, especially by Wi-Fi, by that internet, and people can have the same quality of education even in the village. So many new progress nowadays taking place in China. So I said this, if we focus on the countryside modernization, it doesn't mean agriculture modernization. It means that how to make the rural people enjoy the equal public service by the equal investments from the central and the local. So that is my arguments. I think that the time is over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nguyen. I have asked each of the panelists to define modernization however they think is appropriate for their case. And I think Professor Nguyen has given us a very articulate definition of how he views rural modernization, which is an equality or equity between city and countryside, and given us a very insightful overview of changing Chinese policies since the late 20th century, since the Asian financial crisis, beginning with the New Socialist Countryside campaign that was initiated at a moment when the regime found itself in rural crisis, and then looking at different ways to change and alter and ameliorate those programs in subsequent years. So thank you very much, Professor Nguyen. I will turn next to Professor Han Bilhyun. Professor Han is also a very prolific writer, in his case on Korea's rural development. He has focused especially on the well-known Saemal Undong, or New Village movement of the 1970s in Korea, that had a transformative impact on the living conditions of Korean villagers. Professor Han was educated at Seoul National University, but has been a professor at the Academy of Korean Studies since 1997. And in addition to his work on Korea, he's also undertaken comparative studies of community traditions in China and Vietnam. And I'm especially pleased also to note that Professor Han is a distinguished alumnus of the Harvard-Yenching Institute, having been a visiting scholar at Harvard-Yenching 20 years ago in 2001, 2002. So let me turn now to Professor Han for his comments.
Thank you, Professor Perry. And also I learned a lot, Professor Wendy Jin. And his remarks remind me of my childhood. I was born in a rural area. I lived in my village until 15 years old. So I participate in rural Saemal Undong, New Village movement in the 1970s. Also today, it's what is it? It's a Good Friday, remembering the suffering of Jesus Christ. So tonight we are remembering the suffering of peasants during the economic modernization. Today I'll talk about the three things. The first, so-called Semaul Undong, 1970s, and then the structural reform in the 1980s, 1990s. And in conclusion, I talk about the current situation and future of Korea. As Professor Perry mentioned, ecological turn. Semaul Undong was a comprehensive and nationwide rural modernization program. Its achievements first grassroots level impact at the village and peasants. As you know, there were many development programs in the 1960s, 70s. They were successful at the national level, but not much impact for peasants. But Semaul Undong was quite good at improving living conditions of farmers, peasants, and eradication of poverty and income increase. Also, it did a lot for rural village infrastructure improvement, village-based reforestation. Without the village-based reforestation, Korea's reforestation could not be successful. And also it contributed a lot to the improvement of rural women's status. The characteristics of Semaul Undong is first, government and village productive partnership, and then also self-help villagers initiative and their accountability, and also government policy to support the villages and peasants were quite unique, so-called performance-based support. If you know Alice Armstead's book, Asia's Next Giant, the Korean government took this policy to support industrial companies. So if you do well, do better, then the government support more than others. And also the Semaul Undong was to help farmers have more income. So most programs were related to material incentives. So the virtuous circle between benefits and active participation during the movement. During the Semaul movement, there were many documents and records produced at the village level. Some of them remain, most of them were disappeared. Some remaining documents now is registered as UNESCO Memory of the World. It registered in 2013. We can summarize the achievement of Semaul Undong. The first is income revolution. It's really remarkable. 10 times more increased. And also improvement of living conditions, especially electrification, running water, and also kitchen, toilets, village inroads, and housing. If you were in 1960s Korea, village really terrible. And it was drastically changed. And also it's a very much broad-based and inclusive growth. So the movement was not focused on selective village. It targeted all the villages, so-called no village left behind. The operation unit was a natural village. In Korea, we have administrative unit village, but the natural village has a long history, like 400 or 300 years old. So they know each other among villagers. It's well integrated. So they can avoid the problem of free ride issues. Also, 1960s and 70s, Korea was very active in Green Revolution. Green Revolution was combined with the Semaul movement. And I mentioned the reforestation. So because of this, Korean Semaul Undong is a symbol of poverty reduction in Korea's various programs. I would say some success factors. The first is government and village active partnership. And the government has some concrete, specific category to evaluate the achievement annually, like 5 categories. The most important category is income increase of households, and also the amount asset of village credit cooperative and improvement of living conditions, etc. So also women's active participation was very, very important. They were very active in attacking gambling, alcohol abuse, and also they were leaders in savings movement, community credit cooperative, and income increase projects. And also Semmaundong was very, very successful in job creation, especially in off-season jobs. In the winter, at that time, we couldn't have any jobs in the countryside, but Semmaundong changed the landscape. So they introduced the greenhouse. We call it the white revolution, greenhouse. And Sema factories, like a small industry and community credit cooperative. It was very, very helpful for savings movement and also increasing rural income and consumer cooperatives. This is just one page from village. This is a real meeting records. So villagers actively participate in their programs. So in this village, the household 90. So 82 here, 82 participate. After they work, after dinner, they have a village meeting voluntarily. So 90 or 80% household participate in the village meeting. And this is another example of the achievement of Sema movement. So attitudinal change and self-help spirit was developed. So this is one example from a poor village and also a poor household. So the village got the award from the government. So the villagers discussed how to use this money, and they selected 10 poorest households. They support with a cow. So they started cow bank program, and the recipient households say, I'll do my best. I'll be rich with this project. I think like that. So it's kind of a promise. After this impressive success of Semmaundong, but Korea faced another big challenge, as Professor Wendy Jin mentioned, the global competition. Uruguay round and WTO were the major player for this globalization in the 1980s, 1990s. So the Korean government thought we need a new, different approach to tackle the globalization issues, and they poured huge money in enhancing the global competitiveness of Korean agriculture and the peasants. So first, capital-intensive farming, and then enlarging farm size. But many reports says those experiment was a big failure. First, self-sufficiency of Korean agriculture worsened, and the farm crisis deepened, and the rural debt skyrocketed, and the rural community threatened. So Korean farmers or peasants are quite conservative historically, but 1980s, 90s, Korean peasants become very radical and violent. They went to America, US, Canada, Brazil, Hong Kong, wherever the WTO have meetings. And then 1980s, a new movement, as Professor Perry mentioned, ecological turn. It's a small group, Han Salim group. It's a small group. It started from a church in a small town, a Catholic church. The church was very active in democratization movement. And in the ecological turn, there were three big leaders. One, the most important is Mr. Jang Il-sun. He is an activist philosopher. Surprisingly, he's a self-taught philosopher. And he learned the Taoism and Korean native religion, Eastern learning, 1860s. And another leader, famous dissident poet Kim Ji-ha. And third, also very important person, Catholic priest. He was also dissident. In Korean Catholic, there is a special group, so-called the Priest of Peace and Justice. This Han Salim group lead a movement, ecological turn. They emphasized organic farming and anti-nuclear movement, ecological turns. This movement started in 1980s and it grew fast. So some progressive Korean government those requests. So in current status of Korea, we don't have any comprehensive one policy, but based on this ecological turn, we have very diverse specific programs, local food movement, direct payment, slow food movement, rural industry, rural tourism, and also art and culture, and e-trade, direct trade. I think those issues are related to rural reconstruction in China. This is from a small village in Ireland. It's a very fancy restaurant, guest house. Also, it has windmills for wind power. So the rural landscape is, but again, it's just a promise and hope. It's not a mainstream policy. I think I have to stop here. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Han. Professor Han's discussion of the Saemal Undong, I think, is very relevant for a number of the other presentations here. The New Socialist Countryside movement that Professor Nguyen talked about in his comments was, I believe, very strongly influenced by the Saemal Undong. The Chinese government sent a number of delegations to Seoul to learn about the Korean experience, and a number of Korean academics and policy makers were also invited to China to share their experience in the Saemal Undong with Chinese planners as they launched the New Socialist Countryside campaign. So we're talking here not only about comparisons from one country to another, but also about interactions from one experimental effort to another. I'd like to turn next to Professor Wendy Phuong Cham, who received her training in cultural studies at the Vietnam Academy of Social Sciences, where she conducts research on rural cultural heritage and changes in village cultural practices. In addition to her work on Vietnam, she has also conducted research in Guangxi province in China on questions of women's migration, transnational Vietnamese-Chinese marriages, border trade between the two countries, and so forth. And I'm also delighted to mention that Professor Cham, like Professor Han before her, is a valued alumna of the Harvard-Yenching Institute. She was in residence at Harvard-Yenching as a visiting scholar in 2006 to 2007. And then she returned in 2009 as a coordinate researcher working on a joint project with Professor Hui Tam Tai. Cham, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for Professor Perry. Thank you for inviting me to this roundtable. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good morning. Today, I'm very happy to share with you some information about the new rural program in Vietnam, some successes and some challenges with that program. First of all, I want to give some general information about this program in Vietnam. The new rural program, full name is National Targets Program for New Rural Construction, is national key program to support for all rural areas. The concept of this program is from South Korean Sima Undung, with the important goal of building a new village, and from the Chinese model of Tam Nong, support to agriculture, countryside, and farmer. The overall goals of this program is transform the entire Vietnamese countryside towards modernization, developing in all aspects, economy, culture, infrastructure, livelihood, information, and so on. The new rural program defined 19 criteria in quantitative format and uses them as a scale to evaluate new countryside. 19 criteria divided by 5 basic contents. First, rural planning. Second, socio-economic infrastructure. Third, economy and production organization. Fourth, culture, society, environment. Fifth, political system. Accordingly, any commune that meets the criteria will be recognized as meeting the standards. District with 75% of commune meeting the standards will be recognized as a new rural district. Provinces with 80% of districts meeting the standards will be recognized as the new rural province. In the 10 years, 2010 to 2020, Vietnam has 66% commune units meeting the new rural standards. 24% district units meet the new rural standards. 19% provinces and cities have 100% of communes recognized as meeting new rural standards. Now, I want to talk about some successes of this program in Vietnam. First, this program is widely implemented in all rural areas of the country, providing equitable access of all rural community to the investment resources of the program. This synchronization also creates a modern atmosphere of rural renewal in all locality and ethnic groups. Second, this program have active participation of both the political system and the people. The program follows the slogan, the state and people work together, contribute both material and human resources. People not only contribute money to a specific job, but they also contribute their labor directly and especially donate land to build community houses, build roads, expand schools, and so on. In that way, the program have brought into play the internal resources of the community, mobilized abundant material and spiritual resources from the people, and that have made this program closer and familiar with the people, creating for them sense of ownership, and people participate voluntarily and responsibly. The third, this program have a holistic approach that not only focuses economic factors, like many previous rural assistance programs, but also pays attention to many factors at the same time: economy, culture, environment, political institution, infrastructures, communication, gender equality. However, this program also expose many limitations and challenges. First, a scale of 19 criteria with 5 contents is applied for all rural community, regardless of reason, ethnic group, or natural, economic, and social conditions of each community. Such use of one model for all have created a similarity in the model of innovation and rural development. After a period of implementation of the program, Vietnam's rural appearance has become the same, from landscape, infrastructure, to development direction and goals. Second, on a scale of 19 criteria, many criteria are rigid, not flexible, and not suitable for diverse needs and contexts of community, ethnic groups, such as the garbage pits, cemetery, cultural houses, or roadside tree planting. For example, many ethnic minority communities already have communal houses, but in order to meet new rural standards, they still have to build a community cultural house. However, people do not use this cultural institution because they are unfamiliar with their custom and practices. Third, culture in the new rural program is understood in a very, very narrow sense. Only cultural institutions and superficial activities of culture, but not understanding culture in terms of community organization, relationship, social relation, indigenous class system, belief, or choices. Therefore, cultural development is only understood as increasing cultural activities, building cultural institutions. This reduces cultural diversity, which is an important resource for the development of community and ethnic groups. On the other hand, culture is understood in isolation from other factors such as environment, organization of production, labor, employment, and specific agricultural products, while culture is present in all factors and is an important foundation governing the implementation of the criteria. After 10 years of implementing the new rural program, many lessons can learn. First, the rural development and support program need to pay special attention to the participation of people from policy-making process to program implementation decisions, highlighting their voices, roles, and needs and their choices and decisions. Second, it is necessary to have an overall approach and look at economic, political, cultural, and social factors is close linkage. Third, it should be understood that rural areas are not homogeneous mass and all the same, but the countryside is very different between the region and ethnic groups. Therefore, should not use one model for all, but to consider diversity of needs, choices, and cultural expressions. Fourth, culture always needs to be understood in broad sense, not only including cultural and artistic activities, but also many other factors of thinking, way of doing, choosing, family and community relationship, class system, belief, and so on. Currently, the new rural program in Vietnam is continuing to be implemented for the period 2021 to 2025, with the goal that by 2025, the whole country have at least 15 provinces complete the construction of new countryside. 40% of districts, towns, and provincial cities have completed the task of building a new countryside. The whole country have 80% of communes meeting the new rural standard. If this program do not overcome the existing challenges, do not pay enough attention to the above lessons, the goal of program may be achieved, but the quality and the effectiveness of this program will be very limited, and the face of countryside in Vietnam will modernize in a uniform and unsustainable direction. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I really appreciate your comment and question. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Cham, for that very balanced view of the New Rural Development Plan, pointing out the very impressive achievements, but also the problems with a one-size-fits-all approach and the need for diversity. Next, we will turn to Professor Nishikawa Kunio, who was educated at the University of Tokyo and has been teaching in the College of Agriculture at Ibaraki University since 2014. Professor Nishikawa is an agricultural economist, and his research has focused particularly on sustainability of small-scale rice farming from the perspective both of government price supports and also from the perspective of community-based organizations. His work has been based on extensive field surveys and interviews that he has conducted with farmers, with government officials, and with local co-op representatives in different parts of the Japanese countryside. And like other members of this panel, he's engaged in comparative work. In his case, the comparison has been with rice farming in California, where Professor Nishikawa recently conducted research at the University of California at Riverside. Let me turn now to Professor Nishikawa.
Okay, I will share the PowerPoint. Wait a moment. Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, Professor Perry. I'm very delighted to join this roundtable to discuss the success and challenge of Japanese rice farming. The title of my remark is Success and Challenges for Increasing Rice Farming Productivity in Japan. So I will talk about this theme. Rice is a significant crop for Japan as well as many Asian countries, but low productivity has been a problem for a long time. In fact, there has been a large gap in production costs between Japan and other export countries, which has become an issue with the progress of trade liberalization. In 2019, the production cost in Japan was 7.8 times higher than that of California. On the other hand, Japanese rice farming, which has been managed by family laborers, has continued to increase its productivity during 20th century modernization. So why has the productivity gap not been reduced? Japan has undertaken two types of efforts to increase rice farming productivity, one of which was successful, while the other was not. The most successful effort was to increase yield. This means production quantity per area before 1970s, which resulted in the highest yield of Japanese rice worldwide at that time. However, after 1970s, due to the labor outflow from farm households and the rapid economic growth, the Japanese government changed its policy. Then the most tough effort was to expand farm size, which took into consideration the GATT-Uruguay Round Agreement and California as a potential competitor. I will discuss both efforts in detail. A key element to help explain the situation is the small and scattered distribution of farmland in Japan. Japan's rice yield rose from 1900 to 1970, which is comparable with California. As noted previously, it was the highest worldwide at that time. There are a number of reasons for this success. First, local experiment stations developed high-yielding varieties. Second, farmers chose some methods to adapt for use with these high-yielding varieties. They introduced small machines to save on labor and deployed the workforce into, for example, mowing, watering, and fertilization. The farmer practices tsuihi in Japanese, meaning that additional fertilization before harvest, and it represented intensive fertilization. Third, extension services, agriculture cooperatives, and grassroots farmers group disseminated the methods above. In Kochi Prefecture, in the southern part of Japan, rice was produced twice a year in the 1960s. The farmer harvested rice and planted seedlings concurrently in August. During the busy season, they even worked at night. In this picture, you can see straw with rice being dried after harvest, a man cultivating with a small cultivator, and women planting seedling at the same time. Intense labor input was necessary because yield would decline if any of those tasks were delayed. Farmers expended time and effort because they were afraid of decline in yield. Next, I will talk about the scale size expansion after 1970s. In 2015 and 2017, the average size of Japanese rice farms was 3.4 acres, in contrast with 397 acres in California. The scale gap is so large that it would be impossible for Japan to catch up with California, even though, as I said, Japanese farmers have expanded their farm size. In this graph, it is difficult to see Japan's blue bar because the gap is very big, so we cannot see the Japanese blue bar. Furthermore, they cannot use large machines efficiently due to farmland plots being small and scattered. Finally, the shortage of family labor has also prevented farmers from managing their holding intensively. As a result, production costs have not declined steadily now. This picture shows Japanese small and scattered farmland plots on large farms in 2011. It can be clearly seen that each plot is very, very small. Plot managed by this farmer painted in blue and red. Blue is rice and red is wheat are scattered. A plot size in California painted in yellow is 7 to 25 times larger than that in Japan. This farm size is 159 acres, which is considerably large in Japan. These farms go out from own community within red line to borrow farmlands, but his farmlands are scattered. There is also a new movement. The Japanese government has started to promote production of feed rice with high-yielding varieties. Moreover, some farmers and agriculture cooperatives have begun to export rice with these types of varieties. They are grown with intensive fertilization and new technologies to reduce production costs. Policies for maintaining rural populations are also focused on revitalizing agriculture and rural areas. The results have not been clarified, but we must continue to pay attention to these new approaches. The implications for the Asian countryside in the 21st century from the Japanese perspective are as follows. First, given the dense population and the small and scattered farmland plots, governments and farmers should not neglect labor-intensive methods of increasing yield to improve the productivity of rice farming. Second, an adequate sized population, although it is difficult to estimate its appropriate level, but it should be maintained in rural areas to secure guaranteed labor supply in agriculture production, secure employment, and emphasizing the attractiveness of rural areas are important, I think. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Nishikawa. And the question that you ended with on how we keep an adequate labor force size in the countryside is a question that's also, I noticed, been brought up in several of the questions in the Q&A. So I think we will, in a minute when we conclude, want to get to this question of how we do, in fact, keep people in the countryside, if that's an important part of modernizing rural Asia. But let me first turn to Professor Sukumar. Professor Sukumar has been teaching women's studies at the University of Calicut in Kerala for the past 15 years. In both her publications and her policy and advocacy work, she focuses particularly, although not exclusively, on questions of women's empowerment, both economic and political empowerment. She's been active in a variety of projects that train women for greater participation, both in rural development and in local government. And she's helped to encourage research and publications in women's studies and in gender studies more broadly. So let me turn now to Professor Sukumar.
Thank you, Professor Perry, and thank you for inviting me for this roundtable and giving me the chance to interact with the most important scholars of Asia. Professor Nguyen said, how do we explain the modernization? Is a question for me also. And I think I prefer to spell out the types of modernization as part of the, it is in terms of the participation of women in community structures and the decision-making process of the community, society in a whole. In that context, I wish to talk about some of the programs introduced by the government of India and modified by the state governments, implemented through women's groups in the countryside of India. And basically, I wish to talk about 3 programs which are considered as they are working together in the countryside of India, and especially the state from where I am coming, Kerala. That is the 3 government programs. That one is the Mahatma Gandhi National Employment Guarantee Scheme, which is popularly known as the Employment Guarantee Scheme or Mannarekha. The second one is the wider network of women self-help groups for initiating the microcredit programs throughout India, which started in the early 1990s, and the state poverty eradication program. And the third one is the Mahila Kisan Shaktikaran Pariyojana, which is an empowerment program for women farmers that is also implemented through the self-help group networks of women. I think it should be good for giving a little background of the planning and development process of India to understand the importance of these 3 programs. And drawing up extensive plans of 5-year basis by a centralized agency, the Planning Commission of India was practiced in India from 1950s onwards. And this was deeply influenced by the Soviet socialist planning model initiated by the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru. That model was upholding the community participation and also the structuring of the locality of the community in the rural side. The Planning Commission used to set up the developmental priorities, policies, and allocate funds for central and state plans. It was like a direct, centralized, top-down model. And from the first 5-year plan itself, schemes for mobilizing local effort for local development have to receive high priority. Programs of community development based on the principle of aiming at an intensive all-round development of selected areas are the special value for this point of view. Agriculture, including irrigation, was given high priority, followed by power, transportation, and industries. The second 5-year plan, that is from the 1956 to 71, based its approach in the socialist pattern of society that made people capable of rising their life in terms of economic and social status. It was given priority for employment generation and industrialization. From there onwards, we can see that the industrialization, especially the heavy industries, are becoming more important, and agriculture still having the central concern, but its importance is losing in a particular form. But we can see a change of this approach from 1990s onwards. It's a major departure was seen in the adoption of new economic reforms of liberalization. I think here most of the presentations here, we are all sharing that change of approaches during this period. After the liberalization, the liberalization policies implemented in the country, the relevance of centralized planning for 5-year terms became irrelevant, and mainly because of the decisive role of the markets in the economic regime in determining priorities. And 1990s indicated a paradigm shift in objectives of planning and development. From the 8th 5-year plan, that plan evaluated that developmental planning in India proved to be achieved by planning for the growth, modernization, self-reliance, and social justice. It has undertaken a re-examination and reorientation of the role of governments and process of planning. And it worked out ways to involving people in the developmental tasks and builds up the strengthens people's participatory institutions and programs. We can see a clear prioritization of sectors, projects for investment in order to facilitate operationalization and implementation of the policy initiatives taken in the areas of fiscal trade and industrial sectors and human development. Here also we can see the creation of social security networks or the security net through employment generation, improved healthcare, and provision of extensive educational facilities throughout the country. But the shift here is that the role of the government is reformulated and the private players are becoming very important. And poverty alleviation, livelihood restoration, and microcredit programs were implemented through participative process in which community involvement has enhanced. Throughout these programs, the community become very important for the management of poverty of their own area. It is like some of the critics are saying that the poor people living in the countryside becoming the manager of their own poverty, and the state is withdrawing itself from welfare programs. And in this phase, the local governance structures were strengthened by decentralization of state governance, by restructuring the local self-government institutions that popularly known in India as the Panchayat Raj institutions, with a clear emphasis on local development. We can see a major shift in this period that the local governments become very central to the planning and local development process. There was a new law was passed in 1992 for the reformulation of the local self-government with more power and more fiscal funds and all, and they become the central mechanism for rural development. And for rural areas, a three-tier system of village councils or called Gram Panchayats, and then another system of block panchayats and district panchayats were created. The urban local bodies were also reconstructed with a mandate on local planning, development, and urban governance. And this phase is also important in bringing out women into development process at grassroots level as participants, organizers, and managers of the programs. And women become their role has been changed from passive recipients of welfare to managers of the development program. In this new law enacted for the restructuring of local self-government, there is a reservation for women in the elected bodies of the three-tier system. That also made certain impact on increasing the women's participation. And in this context, I wish to talk about the evolution of this Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Generation Scheme, and which was considered as the most important policy intervention with respect of addressing the issue of rural poverty, unemployment, and crisis in agriculture after the advent of the economic liberalization in the Indian economy. This National Employment Guarantee Scheme was implemented in 2005, and it is considered as one of the largest and most ambitious public works programs in the world, which is legally entitling, gives a legal entitlement for all rural adults for 100 days of paid employment per household. So this is considered as a new method or a new program to address the rural poverty, creating public employment. And the core objectives are for guaranteeing a basic livelihood security to rural households, providing not less than 100 days of unskilled manual work as a guaranteed employment in a financial year to every household in rural area. And it is as per demand coming from the rural area itself, and also resulting in creation of productive assets of prescribed quality and durability. And strengthening of livelihood resource base of work, proactively ensuring social inclusion, and strengthening the Panchayat Raj local government institution are the other core objectives. The major works coming under this Mahatma Gandhi Employment Guarantee Scheme it is mainly related to the agriculture and environmental conservation. They include water conservation, watershed management, micro and minor irrigation projects like creation, restoration and maintenance of irrigation canals and drains, renovation of traditional water bodies like ponds and drains, and afforestation like tree plantations and horticulture related to tree plantation, and local development work in common lands, common grazing lands and common lands to be developed. If they are not used for a long time, like considered as fallow lands, it can be renewed, and works for promoting agricultural productivity. Some supportive work for the farms for creating or increasing agricultural productivity. All these works are created for ensuring some sort of employment for the rural poor. And the entire program was operationalized through the basic local governance structure of the local government institutions. The Gram Panchayat or the village council is responsible with implementation of this employment guarantee scheme. Identification of works, projects in the Panchayat area as per the recommendation of the lower level ward sabhas or the ward sabhas means a forum of eligible voters in that particular area. They can recommend the types of works and they can finalize the works, and preparing development plan and also preparing a shelf of projects for the year and proposals. These are all these operations, all these activities are vested with the village council. And the community has an involvement in creating this shelf of projects. And through this program of MNRGS, we can see a higher level of women's participation. Originally, it is not considered as a program for women. It is like a general program for the rural poor adults. But women become more actively participated in the program, mainly because it is an opportunity for them to get an employment. Because women's work participation rates outside home are still very low in India. Women have lesser opportunities and more hurdles, structural as well as social hurdles, to enter into the paid employment outside home. And those who are in the rural labor, the women, those who are engaged in the rural labor, are mainly contributing to the family labor, or considered as subsidiary workers who are not in a regular basis. Some are working in seasonal basis, some in casual basis, and getting lower wages. So the gender roles in family and community are also have an adverse effect on women's paid employment. So there are a lot of hurdles for women to be part of the rural employment scene. And the new scheme of MNRGS created rural women an opportunity for paid employment, since it is unskilled labor, because most of the women have no skilled, are not prepared for skilled labor, and also the allocation of the work is based on households and also managed by the participation of the community. So it created an opportunity for women, and it provided women with greater choice and capabilities and participation in intra-household decision-making process because of the income they are getting through this employment guarantee scheme. And this program shows an increased participation of women as workers and also as managers. Each work site is managed by a mate, a person who is selected from the same group of workers. And in most cases, these mates are women. And this enhanced women's participation in agriculture and nature conservation. And we can see from the later 2000, towards 2005 and after that, we can see there is an enhanced activities in the agriculture sector. And the third one is the gender mainstreaming programs initiated by the central government as well as the state level governments from 1970s onwards. We can see that women as a development category has emerged during the 1970s, mainly due to the governmental initiatives followed by the International Decade of Women and the UN developmental programs, etc. And the community participation and women's participation become a central approach from 1990s onwards, and the governmental programs in development sectors are mainly implemented through the women's groups formulated at the local level. In this period, the microcredit and women's self-help groups become very central to the developmental approach of development. And during this period, in most of the states in India, they initiated poverty alleviation programs through women's self-help groups and microcredit programs. And in these networks created an enhanced participation of women in the rural countryside. That was a major shift in women's participation and their entry to the public sphere of the community. And I consider this phase starting from the 1990s and continuing now. This is an important period of time in which the rural women become central to the developmental programs in the country. And in this context, I am shifting to the one successful model of women empowerment or the women's network started as part of this microcredit program by Government of Kerala in 1995. That is called as Kudumbashree, and now it is grown as a network of 45 lakhs women and representing 45 lakhs households in the state. And Kudumbashree was originally established as a joint program of Government of Kerala and the National Bank for Rural Development, and implemented through the community-based organizations called Women's Neighborhood Groups. They are organized within a geographical boundaries of a local self-government institution, that is Gram Panchayat, and it was formally registered as the federation of all these groups are formally registered as the State Poverty Eradication Mission, and it was formally registered in 1998. And
thank you, Professor Sukumar. I will have to ask you to wrap up in about 1 more minute, if I may.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. And the convergence between local government programs and this women's network created a new model of developmental activism in the countryside. And as part of this, the women's joined group farming groups, the farming groups are initiated in the countryside, and the women are coming from the farming communities, and they themselves created groups of 4 each, and then they are federated at the Gram Panchayat level, and they started group farming. And this group farming process has created a revival of agriculture in the countryside of Kerala, and it proves a successful model in reviving agriculture and also helping out the local economic growth. And the relevance of this group farming of women is mainly because most of these women are landless and they have no land of their own, and they pooled together, they leased the land, and they started the cultivation. And we can see a growing feminization of agriculture in the rural countryside of Kerala. And it also gives the women, that collectivity of women give an access to get the land and for cultivation. And now this group farming has proved that it was a very successful, and it is also proved that a main source of vegetables, paddy, and other producers during this COVID time, because all other activities are shut down during the lockdown and after, but the agriculture and this group farming activities were very active, and they produced vegetables for the community kitchens and for the new restaurants started, for the low-cost restaurants started in the countryside. So during this COVID time, these are they can continue with their work, and they keep the community alive with their intervention. So because of the time constraints, I am stopping here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I found particularly interesting your discussion of the shift from central to local governments in planning and empowering local people. And I think that may be an issue that we will also want to discuss as a group. I also thought your discussion of the Mahatma Gandhi National Employment Guarantee Scheme was quite fascinating. And I think it relates to the question that a number of members of the audience have raised, which is, how do we attract people to the countryside these days? If it is true that over the past century or so, what we've seen is a massive internal migration out of the countryside into the cities, the hollowing out of rural villages, we might have a temporary reversal under COVID conditions of this past year in some countries. But if it is important that the countryside maintains a substantial population, both for economic reasons and for social, cultural, and political reasons, how do we, in fact, attract people back to the countryside, or make it sufficiently attractive for people who have returned under crisis conditions to actually want to remain in the countryside? So let me ask that question to the panelists, and let me also invite the panelists to ask each other questions if you would like to. I will try to serve as moderator here. But let me ask, would any of the panelists like to first comment on this question of what can or should be done, whether it's by local governments or by non-governmental social groups or other means in order to make life in the countryside more attractive for some who have already left or some who have returned only temporarily. Professor Nguyen, would you like to make some comments about that question?
I think that is a very interesting question because nowadays we have 30 million migrants from rural and flow out from rural to the coastal area and the cities. But we also need to pay attention to last year when the total number of the people out of job is more than 40 million. And among them, 30 million come back. No, it's 30 million. And in 300 million out of the countryside go to the coastal area, but 10% of them last year out of job. And then they kick out and then they come back to the countryside. That's one thing we need to pay attention. The second, nowadays, there are almost 540 million middle class population in China. Few people pay attention to such number. And then most of these middle class in the world keen on some kind of, some kind of life, not like in the very hustled urban area. They would like to enjoy their life in countryside. But we don't have any policy to encourage them to go to countryside. We don't have the policy to make them to have, to maintain their properties in countryside in the village. So, and personally, I have been many years living in the village when I have a time. And I write my book, I give my speakings, I give answers, and then by the web. And so many things I can do in the village, but I cannot have the property rights in the village. So nowadays, when we set up a kind of new trends, new policy, new strategy, try to encourage the urban people go to the countryside, and then merge with, giving them the title as a kind of new villagers. And nowadays, thousands of these people now move to the countryside. Give you an example. In Zhejiang, one village in Anji County, there are 3,000 Shanghai citizens live in one village, including of these 100 people from overseas. So, and in Shanxi, there is a village nearby Xi'an, but it's also 84 kilometers from Xi'an. It's not so easy. We need 1 hour at least drive to this village. There is also 3,000 citizens live in this village. So if you do set up some policy, there are many people from the city would like to stay in countryside because that is more easier to communicate with the world. We have a very perfect infrastructure construction in the village, including of the web and the internet and the 5G and whatever. So that is a different situation. Originally, from 1980s, the hukou is a big issue, and then a lot of people cannot move. But nowadays, the flow to urban is free, and then they come back to the countryside also good. But the block, I mean the barrel is that still be there. It's a barrel, the citizens going down to the countryside. So we need to change the policy. We need to do the reform, and then we may have the integration between rural and urban. So nowadays we have done a lot of things for bridging the people, and then that will be a new trend. So you can see what happened in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Clearly, the infrastructure question is critical. Many of us here have places in the countryside too, but it turns out to be impossible to teach by Zoom from many parts of the American countryside because our Wi-Fi connections are not strong enough. So I have thought many times that it would be much easier to telecommute from rural China than from rural America. So that clearly remains an important issue. Cham, Professor Wendy Phuong Cham, please.
Okay, I want to share more with you. In rural Vietnam today, the working age youth and middle age in rural area are always more likely to find jobs with better income in the city and even go to work in abroad. And that is the reason now in Vietnam, many forms of migration become popular in the countryside. Many villages in many regions of Vietnam are now mostly elderly and children, making it difficult to implement the new rural program in specific and other programs for countryside assistance in general. But Vietnam government really want to use the new rural program to make the countryside is more development like the city. So it's limit the immigration from the countryside to the city. But now it's not really successful that. So the people from countryside still want to go to the city, and that is a very, very popular now. So in the city like Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City or Da Nang, it's so crowded and very polluted. But the people from the countryside still want to go to the city. So that makes the imbalance unequal from the city and the rural. That is the fact that in the big city in Vietnam now. So the government really want to limit that way, but the program of new rural program is not successful for that, for limit the immigration from countryside now. So yeah, I want to share more with you that fact, and I want to have question with the Professor Han from Korea, and as the presentation concern the Simao Undong focus on the empowerment for women. I want to ask you, is it successful in village level? Because I want to share with you some cases in Vietnam. In Vietnam, it's the same policy to empowerment for women in countryside, but it's not successful. Even give the woman more burden because they have to the same family work, and besides they have to work outside in social work. So even the woman working outside, when they come back to family, they have to work. Family work is the same, but some researchers said that is not empowerment for women. Even it's give the woman more burden for that. So I want to ask you, is it successful in Korea, but in village level only? Thank you.
Professor Han.
Thank you. Yes and no. It's a quite a critical issue. In 1970s, in 1960s, the status of women, especially in rural area, very low. And but they stood up against domestic violence. At that time, it's quite impressive. So women associated at the village, they stood up against domestic violence. They call a violent husband at the Women's Association, and they criticize. They ask to apologize in public. Also, they led savings movement, and in village they had what is it? Drinking cafe, taverns, and Women Association decide to abolish the tavern. And also, if they find some gambling place, they attack the place. So quite radical, like in Cultural Revolution in China. But yes, they had the dual duty and family works and outside works. That problem was not solved. But some researchers also, I had many interviews with female leaders. They say they were empowered and enjoyed their improvement of their status. And about attracting people to the countryside, I think since 1990s in Korea, every presidential candidate, when they had a presidential campaign, always they pledged to attract people to the countryside, and they will make better villages which attract young people, but not successful. When I was young, maybe around 80%, 70% were rural people, but now in the Korea whole population, about 5% rural people. So it's a big challenge. I think the challenge comes from that fact that in the countryside, it's difficult to have a good medical hospitals. It's really, really tough to have good hospitals. In Korea, I think in Vietnam, similar. Urban primacy. Seoul is too big. And if you know Korea, we have a second largest city, Busan, and third, Daegu. So we think the demise of provincial towns and cities and village has more problem. So medical facilities and educational facilities, parents had to send kids to the city for high school or college, and also cultural facilities. So we have a lot of issues, not just income. So some cooperatives and some young groups also, they were influenced by Professor Tiejun. So they work hard to attract people. They try to establish some new model small factories, cooperatives in the countryside. So there are some successful cases. They attract new people to the countryside. So government works hard and the NGO works hard, but still two big gaps between big cities and the countryside in Korea.
Thank you, Professor Han. Professor Nishikawa, would you like to make any comments about attracting people back to the Japanese countryside?
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm also interested in Professor Han's presentation about the Sema Undo, and especially I'm interested in his explanation of after dinner meeting in rural areas, after dinner meeting, because this is some kind of same as Japan. Men in rural area eat eat dinner at home. After that, they meet and discuss each other. They gather to some building in rural areas and meet and discuss about the village issues. So this is some kind of the man's traditional, but recently people who want to go to rural area. It's increasing in Japan, and especially women are more interested in rural area recently. So this is some kind of the big question I have. Rural area is some kind of the man's world, but the woman is recently more interested in rural area. But so I want to know why this happened in Japan. So this is my comment.
And I don't know if Professor Sukumar, if you would like to make any further comments on either on the gender difference that Professor Nishikawa just raised of women's interest in the rural area compared to men's, or more generally on attracting population to return to or to stay in the countryside. You mentioned the National Employment Guarantee, but of course, as Professor Han mentioned, even if the income is there, without public services like medical care and good universities and so forth, it may be very difficult to retain the most energetic or the most talented people in the countryside.
Yeah, well, I think you have asked the question about, mentioned about the migration, the flow of people from big cities to countryside in India when the COVID pandemic started. Mainly in India, I think the most important factor which pushed out people from the countryside to the cities is employment. Employment is the major reason because the countrysides are not giving them enough livelihood, and the crisis in agriculture is a major issue. Most of the migrant workers we can see in cities, they are coming from the farming families or communities from the rural side. And landlessness is other issue. And in the major Indian reality in the countryside is the structure of the society, that caste system, in which many people are still considered marginalized, landless, without any power or ownership in the land. So that's a major reality, Indian reality that push out people from countryside to the big cities. And now, after this pandemic started, this COVID started, people are coming back. And in our state, that situation is slightly better. But even then, most of the people, our major income source is people working in Middle East, in the Gulf countries. And they are also coming back, losing their jobs and coming back to the countryside. And in the countryside, still have the same problem. So how do we can attract these people? Needs some major changes in terms of land reform and new approaches in reviving the agriculture and make them employment. And then now the rural employment guarantee scheme is only one side, and it gives you only 100 days of labor employment, and all the other days they are jobless. And it's a new good intervention, but still there are issues, that poverty and other issues. Landlessness is a major issue. Access to land is another issue. And the caste system, which is still keeping people outside the power system of the countryside, is still rampant. So I think this is very complex, that one side. And regarding the women's participation, like Professor Nishikawa said, that women are preferred to go to the countryside. But my experience in India is not like that, because the countryside or the villages are more constrained. They are giving more constraint to women because of this social setup or the community networks and the patriarchal setup, which controls women more and more within their families. So the educated women, the girls, they prefer to go out from the countryside to the city, mainly because of increasing their choice, autonomy, and freedom. So these issues are there, still there. So, and also what Professor Cham said about these new forms of employment or social participation, whether it is increasing women's burden. that is also there, but the rural women prefer to take that burden because they get a chance to go outside their homes and they can have some sort of participation in the community and they can earn some living of their own. So they are willing to take that extra burden of housework because still the patriarchal setup is very strong in the countryside of India. That the comment I have to present.
Thank you. We've also received several questions asking about marriage difficulties for rural men, for example, the difficulty of having enough resources to marry and therefore the push out of the countryside into the cities, which is of course of concern in many particularly poorer regions of the countryside. Another issue that has come up in the Q&A and that I'm also quite interested in is your views about top-down versus bottom-up initiated rural reforms and how you assess the pros and cons of state-initiated versus socially initiated reforms. Again, I thought Professor Sukumar made a very interesting point that it may depend on what level of the state we are talking about. So a central state initiative, particularly in a huge country and a diverse country like India or China, will run into difficulties almost immediately as it faces the very diverse conditions from one part of the countryside to another. But if you go down a few levels in terms of what government agencies actually have responsibility for initiating those programs and implementing those programs, designing those programs, perhaps some of that problem is ameliorated. So I'd be very interested. And then I think we will have to wrap up very soon because we are almost at 11 o'clock. We have lots of other questions, but I think there's been an opportunity for the audience to raise some of them directly with the panelists. But let me just close by asking the panelists if they'd like to comment very briefly on this question of top-down versus bottom-up initiated programs. And again, turn first to Professor Wendy Jin, who, as I mentioned, deserves major credit for helping to organize one of the more successful bottom-up efforts in China. But in his talk, talked especially about the advantages of a kind of top-down program like the new socialist countryside. So I'd be very interested in his thoughts about state versus society initiated efforts to modernize the countryside. Professor Nguyen? You need to unmute your microphone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, you know that's 100 years that our intellectual society always emphasized bottom up, and both spiritually and physically. We are trying to make the local villagers to have a kind of self-empowerment by the self-organization. So the first, I must emphasize, let's try to set up the rural people's organization, no matter it's aging association or women association, whatever, even the performance team for the local cultural events, whatever. We need to send a lot of young people going down to the countryside to stay with local people for the organizational renewal. And then by such kind of basic events that when you can help them to organize, and then they may do something for self-empowerment, and then self-management, and then self-development. That is a so-called bottom-up. And then so it means that we must emphasize the organizational renewal. That is my answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would other panelists like to comment on this question of state initiated versus societally initiated efforts to modernize the countryside? Professor
Yeah,
Han?
I think there is a very classical academic issue in social sciences, state versus society or state versus village. I think it's related to democratization. So in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, Korea was not democratized. So those periods, the state-centered approach was a reality. We wanted a kind of bottom-up approach, but it's not feasible. But if we look deeper, the Samuel movement was kind of a dual structure, nationwide state environment. Also at the village level, we had some kind of autonomy. As long as we did not touch political issues. So for the development, so that's why I call it developmentalism. As long as we focus on development, local initiatives were emphasized. But in 21st century, Korea is more democratized. So we see many local groups, they design many projects, and also they ask some support from the government. Also, they send their own representatives to the city council or province assemblies. So I think desirably, I think the bottom-up approach would be much better, sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any of our other panelists wish to make any concluding remarks? Professor Nishikawa.
Okay, regarding the state-initiated versus social initiated, in Japan, I think the agriculture policy is basically initiated by the central government, but they need the bottom-up organization in the rural area. For example, the villages and the agriculture cooperatives. So there are some kind of the coexist in agriculture policy and the rural areas. So yeah, basically policy is initiated by the central government, but they need bottom-up organization. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Cham, any final comments?
Yes, I just want to say that the maybe we can understand the term, the modernization or modern is in the specific meaning following the context of each country. And even in one country, we should understand the modern in the context of the region and ethnic groups. Some ethnic group in Vietnam, they understand the modern is very different with the citizen understand the modern. So in Vietnam, many policies just only understand the modern, and modernization is one way. So that makes some region and ethnic group is very difficult to approach with that meaning from the policy of the government. So sometimes they cannot carry out some project that government give them. So that policy following the style top down is not bottom up. So sometimes it's very difficult for the resident to carry out the project. So that makes some policy is not successful in some region and ethnic group. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a very important point that we might wish to conclude with, that in fact, there are many different views of what modernization is. And those views differ not only between countries, but also within countries. And they may differ not only between rural and urban residents, but also among different ethnic groups who may have very different understandings of the kind of life that they should be leading in the 21st century. And so I think that's one of the more interesting and more challenging questions about developing the countryside and trying to overcome inequities between city and countryside, but without erasing differences that may be very meaningful differences, particularly in terms of traditional culture and various other values that, that we hold dear. So I would like to thank all of our panelists very much for some really fascinating comments today, and also to thank the audience. We have had many, many more questions than we were able to include here, although I think there has been some direct communication between the speakers and the audience, which is good. We've had questions from as far away as Uzbekistan and Nepal, as well as many questions from colleagues here at Harvard and elsewhere. And so I thank you all very much for attending, and I thank the Harvard-Yenching staff, especially Lindsay Strogatz and Francesca Coppola, for their technical efforts and other efforts in putting together this Zoom webinar, and particularly thank the panelists for spending their evening with us. So thank you all so much, and I encourage you to continue to be in communication with each other and with members of the audience. So thank you all very, very much.